In today's video, I wanted to go over a bit about the concept of chosen poverty and how the IBLP really reinforces the idea that you should not be seeking out wealth and you should learn to be content with what you have and actually prioritize having extra funds that you can then give to other people out of generosity at the sacrifice of your own quality of life sometimes. So a really big concept of this that the IBLP was huge on, and my dad really reinforced for us growing up, was that you need to trust in God's provision and the idea that if you need something, it will eventually come to you in God's perfect time, and that you don't need to be concerned at all about the fact that you might be running out of funds if you don't have any known backup or source of, say, food, for example. Then you're just supposed to trust God that eventually, without requesting or seeking out help, somebody's going to bring it to you. And you just need to trust in God. And it's considered a test of your faith and an opportunity for you to develop as a person, because it could include long-term fasting due to not having food during that time. Another really big principle behind this that I was raised with was the idea that among the 10 Commandments, if you're not familiar with it, they are in the Bible and a big thing that people reference. And one of them is do not covet, which means to not indicate any jealousy of what somebody else has and to learn to be content with what you have. And I find it quite ironic, but it should not be surprising at this point, that my father, among many other leaders within IBLP, conveniently thought that they were the exception to that rule, and specifically taught the people below them to follow it because they benefited more from it. This is just one of many instances within IBLP where there is a lot of hypocrisy and double standards regarding what is expected of the majority of people, and then what's actually put into practice depending on where you fall within the rankings. With families who were higher up getting more social privilege, if you want to call it that, and being permitted to get away with a lot more things compared to the people lower down who basically did not have that standing. Now looking back at how this so-called generosity played out in not just my family, but other families as well, it is interesting to consider families like the Duggars, who, if you're not familiar with them, are known somewhat famously in the conservative world for their TLC show because they had 19 children. And it's interesting to see that Jim Bob Duggar did stuff very similar to my father and decided that he was going to turn that show into a ministry, according to what some of his daughters have come out with now, years later. And he told his family that it was all their ministry and the way they represented God for the general public, and never told anybody besides his wife that they were earning an income. And so this is a key way that Jim Bob was able to cover up exactly how wealthy he was, and he was pulling in essentially millions and not paying out a cent of it to any of his children beyond what should be expected regarding basic care of having a child at home and covering the domestic needs just to live. In my family, the way that this played out was with my father deciding that he was going to invest the money that he could and diversify everything, and also start to buy up houses so that he could rent them out. And from a financial point of view, you would think, oh yes, that's so responsible, because then you can actually make your money work for you. However, that actually ended up backfiring for any child in our family who decided that they wanted to try and go to college, because when we applied and had to fill out FAFSA, all of the buildings that he owned essentially ended up being worth around $1 million, and all of that value ended up appearing as though it was cashable money and something that he could sell as necessary to cover tuition. And not only was that not applicable in his case because he would not sell, he also was not going to be supporting any of us. And so that presumption that your parents actually cover college tuition was not applicable at all in our family. If anybody watching this happened to experience something very similar regarding FAFSA and your parents not being willing to help out, I'm curious about how you dealt with it, if you want to explain in the comments below, because I ended up having to pay way more out of pocket and dealing with a whole bunch of problems until I turned 26, and that's the age when officially you no longer have to actually include your parents' info. And that was one of the biggest reliefs for me, to finally be freed from my parents having anything to do with my personal life and what I was going to do with education. My father essentially used all of the income besides what was needed to cover very bare minimum necessities and to keep things running. He used the rest of it to just invest right back in, instead of potentially using some to improve quality of life at home, and just kept focusing on making more money, which he could then use to buy another house or potentially start a different business, because that was his priority. A pretty critical way that my father's decision to focus on investing back into his business really impacted me and my siblings was when we went through periods of food scarcity, and we had times where it would be months on end where we basically would just have salad and bread and butter, and there really was not much else. And we had this tradition to invite people over for dinner, and I think very consciously my father decided that for most of those times, it would be on Sunday evening when our family tradition was to have pancakes. And so that was the perfect buyout and excuse to be serving something that's pretty cheap, but also to make it seem like it was completely normalized and there was no indication that we could possibly be struggling. Another way that my father showed that he was again prioritizing what worked best for him and not really considering the rest of the family is that eventually, once he hit his 50s, he started having more health complications, and he decided that instead of going completely the traditional route with Western medicine, he was going to try some more Eastern focused practices and then do a completely 180 with his diet and go a more juice-focused route for prevention as well as treatment of some current conditions that he had at the time. And when he did that, conveniently, all of those supplements easily cost thousands of dollars, and then anything that had to be done physically to create what he had to be consuming, such as juicing, and producing all of the carrot and green juice and everything else, was done by myself and a couple of my siblings, and he barely did any of it for himself. So we all ended up having to put in effort for him to be able to gain those benefits, but we at the same time were also suffering more from it, because instead of investing that money in improving the food variation that we could choose from and helping to improve our nutrition, he decided he was going to prioritize what he needed. And again, as a way to convince followers that you're doing the right thing when you are choosing poverty, if you want to put it that way, is that the people in leadership will always find a way to manipulate and get you to do what benefits them. And my father was no different with that, and took every opportunity to find free labor, including from his very own children. And he prioritized that and found a way to make a lot of money off of us, but we didn't benefit from it. And this definitely played a role in a lot of us ending up gaining weight during specific times of the year, especially when there was more food available. And that happened to be when we were serving more groups of people. And during that time, we would gain more weight, and then we'd naturally lose more weight when we did not have food due to the scarcity the other times of the year. My parents both also had what is now really clear signs of eating disorders, and were consistently always talking about their weight and bringing it up. And without ever directly saying it to any of us, they gave very clear signs that they were not happy when any of their children gained weight, but they would never actually consider the cause of it, and just thought about ways to try and remedy it as quickly as possible. Such as, if we were going somewhere, they would try and have all of the kids walk as much as possible. And the habits that you establish as a child really do carry over into your adulthood and can continue to cause problems and challenges until you actually face them and try to work through them. And I have now spent well over a decade trying to work through the challenges I have faced regarding food and regulating that, because of the way that it was not reliable when I grew up. And to this day, I don't think that my parents, either of them, have ever acknowledged that or even thought about it as being a potential problem. They just normalized what they decided to do, and then myself and my siblings are here trying to pick up the pieces and figure out next steps, because my parents just think that they were perfect.